The clash of steel had ended. Viking warriors walked among the fallen, their axes dripping, their boots crushing the ashes of what once was a home. The men of the village were gone, their blood spilled into the earth, and what remained was silence broken only by the cries of women. Among them stood one young wife, her face pale in the glow of the flames. She was not taken for mercy or protection. She was taken because she was the spoils of victory. She was the prize that proved the Vikings had triumphed not only over bodies, but over bloodlines. Her arms had clutched her husband as he bled. Yet before her tears could even fall, she was dragged away. The Vikings did not see her as a widow or a daughter of honor. To them, she was proof of conquest. They bound her not with rope, but with humiliation, stripping away the life she had lived and the name she had carried. She would never return to her people. She would be carried across the sea as a captive, her survival a punishment deeper than the death she had been denied. This was the terror left in the wake of the Vikings. Villages burned, warriors slain, and women forced into chains that no sword could cut. The world celebrates the ships and the glory, but behind it lies the suffering of the wives of defeated men. Their voices were erased, their dignity shattered, their fate worse than death itself. Stay with me until the very end, for this is the story of what the Vikings truly did to their victims. And if you wish to uncover more truths hidden in the shadows of history, subscribe now and join this journey. In the age when longships cut through rivers and seas, women stood at the heart of every household. They tended the fire, guarded the memory of ancestors, and held the fragile fabric of daily life. In the farms of Saxon England, in the villages of Francia, in the coastal towns of Ireland, their hands carried water, their voices guided children, their presence gave shape to community. A woman was not only a wife or a mother, she was a keeper of honor and continuity. Yet this place of meaning held a shadow. In times of peace, a woman could own land, could inherit wealth, could advise her kin. But in times of war, she became the most vulnerable prize. When Viking raiders broke through defenses, the men were cut down or driven away, and what remained was the women. To seize them was not only to take bodies, but to take symbols of lineage. Their capture was both a blow to the spirit of a people and a mark of glory for the victors. The chronicles of priests speak of villages where women were rounded up after the battle was lost. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records raids in which entire communities vanished. In Frankish lands, annals describe wives and daughters carried off into the unknown. Some were bound and loaded onto ships. Others were left behind in ruin but stripped of family and home. These accounts, written with fear and grief, reveal that the Viking sword did not end its work with the death of warriors. It reached further, into the lives of those who had never lifted a weapon. Archaeology confirms what words only hint. In markets like Dublin and Hedeby, graves and artifacts tell of women who were foreign to the land, marked by chains and trade. Their lives were measured in silver coins, and their identities reduced to value on a scale. The rise of Viking wealth was built not only on plundered gold, but on human lives. And among those lives, women formed the majority. This collective fate was worse than a battlefield death. A warrior who fell was remembered as brave, his name honored in story. A woman who was taken disappeared into silence. Her memory was erased, her dignity torn away. She lived on, but not as herself. She lived as property, her survival bound to humiliation. Thus, the women of that age carried the heaviest burden. They were both the heart of their people and the first to be broken when the storm of conquest came. In their suffering lies the truest measure of what Viking victory meant. Not only the triumph of warriors, but the slow destruction of those who were never meant to fight. The tide of conquest grew stronger with every season. Viking ships cut through the waves with carved prows, rising like beasts from myth. Behind them, they left villages reduced to cinders, and before them stretched kingdoms unprepared for the storm. With each raid came not only treasure of gold and silver, but the human spoils that gave power its sharpest edge. Women became the most sought-after proof of victory. On the decks of those longships, the captives stood in silence. Some were noble daughters once adorned in silks. Others were farmers' wives who had only known the earth beneath their nails. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder, bound by fear, stripped of identity, their future sealed by the roar of the sea. To the men around them, they were not individuals with names and memories. They were wealth that breathed, a currency as valuable as any chest of coins. When the ships reached Dublin, Hedeby, or York, markets came alive with the cries of traders. Chains rattled, silver clinked, and the women were displayed like objects of desire and domination. A Frankish widow could be sold beside a Saxon maiden, a daughter of Ireland beside a child taken from the Slavic lands. Their price depended on youth, beauty, and health. But the real measure was humiliation. To own a woman taken from an enemy was to wear victory as if it were a crown. Some were kept by chieftains as concubines, their lives absorbed into households where laughter and feasts drowned out their grief. Others were traded to foreign lands, to the courts of Byzantium or the slave pens of the East. Their voices were carried far from their birthplaces. Yet no one recorded their words. They became shadows, faceless testaments to conquest. The sagas that celebrated the daring of Viking raiders rarely spoke of these women. Their stories were silenced beneath the clamor of battles won. But in the quiet of archaeology, their presence lingers. Burials with shackles, scattered bones in trading towns, and the scars of captivity carved into remains whisper of lives that ended in chains. These fragments reveal what the songs concealed. That power was built on suffering, and that behind the pride of warriors lay the broken dignity of countless women. For the communities left behind, the loss of these women was more than grief. It was the unraveling of memory itself. Without them, households collapsed. Lineages were cut. Traditions withered. A battle could destroy a generation of men. But the theft of women destroyed the future of a people. In this theft lay the deepest cruelty, for survival in bondage was a punishment that stretched beyond the grave. Inside the great hall of a Viking chieftain, the fires roared and laughter filled the night. Horns of mead clashed in celebration. Songs praised the gods of war, and shields hung like trophies on the walls. Yet in the corner sat a woman whose silence cut sharper than any blade. She was not part of the feast. She was part of the victory that allowed it. Once a daughter of nobility in the Frankish lands, she now lived as a shadow, her presence barely noticed, except as a reminder of conquest. Her isolation was complete. Surrounded by noise, she heard no familiar voice. Surrounded by warmth, she felt only cold. Every face around her was foreign, every gesture marked by customs she did not understand. At times she closed her eyes to summon the memory of her father's hall, the scent of bread, the sound of her mother's hymns. But the more she remembered, the more the memories turned to torment, mocking her with what could never return. Other women shared her fate, yet they too lived apart. A Saxon wife taken from the eastern coast sat in another household. An Irish maiden served in the kitchen. They were near but divided by language, unable to share comfort. Each woman carried her grief alone. Together they formed a community of silence, one that echoed louder than the songs of their captors. The noblewoman's spirit began to bend. At first, she resisted, keeping her back straight and her gaze proud. As months passed, her silence deepened into withdrawal. She ate little. She spoke never. And the hall began to forget her as if she were a piece of furniture. That forgetting was the cruelest wound. To be ignored, to vanish in plain sight, was a punishment more lasting than the whip. In the solitude of night, she lay awake, listening to the footsteps of guards and the crackle of dying embers. Her body still lived, but her soul felt buried beneath layers of humiliation. She was not yet dead, but she no longer belonged to the world of the living. Her captors believed they had taken a prize, yet what they truly held was a woman dissolving into nothingness. This story was not hers alone. It was the fate of countless wives and daughters taken into foreign halls. Their lives became a theater of absence, where they played roles without words. In them, the true power of conquest revealed itself, not only in the death of warriors but in the slow erosion of those left behind. The isolation that wrapped around them was invisible to the eye, yet it consumed more completely than flame. The women taken in the wake of conquest carried their suffering together, though each endured it in silence. As months turned into years, their bodies revealed the truth of captivity. Faces once full of color grew pale beneath the smoke of foreign fires. Hair thinned, shoulders stooped, eyes lost their brightness. They had been wives, mothers, daughters of proud lineages. But now they walked like shadows, drained of strength by a life they had never chosen. Hunger left its mark on them all. Food was rationed sparingly, given only to keep them alive, never enough to restore vigor. Some bent under the weakness of their limbs. Others coughed through long winters until breath itself became a battle. Illness passed swiftly among them, fevers spreading in crowded quarters, wounds turning to rot because no hand cared to heal. Death did not strike swiftly on a battlefield. It crept slowly through bodies that were starved of care. The mind withered as cruelly as the flesh. Memories of home, once a source of comfort, became blades that cut deeper each day. Dreams carried them back to familiar rivers and hearths, but awakening always returned them to walls they did not know. The silence they were forced to keep turned inward, until thoughts twisted into despair. Whispers of prayers filled the nights, fragments of songs that no one answered. These voices mingled in the dark, a chorus of grief echoing through halls that celebrated conquest. Their decline was collective, yet each woman remained alone in her struggle. They stood beside one another yet could not speak across languages, and so their pain multiplied in quiet. Some carved patterns into wood. Some braided their hair with trembling fingers. Small acts of memory clung to with desperate hands. But these gestures faded as years stretched on, until even resistance seemed meaningless. Captors saw only captives who moved slowly and spoke rarely. But within these women, the erosion was relentless. They were alive, yet hollowed. They fulfilled tasks as commanded, but no longer with the spirit of those who had once held dignity. Breath remained, but hope was gone. Their survival became a punishment, prolonging torment day by day, season by season, until they seemed more specters than human. In the eyes of their conquerors, this was victory complete. Battles were won with the sword, but triumph was sealed in the slow destruction of those left behind. No monument recorded their names. No chronicle preserved their sorrow. Yet the true weight of Viking conquest lay not in the silver they gathered, but in the women who endured a death stretched endlessly over years. The Viking hall was more than a place of feasting. It was the stage on which their vision of power was displayed. Around the central fire sat men who had returned from raids, their voices raised in boasts, their arms heavy with silver. The presence of women within these walls carried a meaning shaped by their culture. Among their own kin, women of Norse birth could inherit property, could demand divorce, could stand with a measure of independence that was rare in much of medieval Europe. Yet for those taken from conquered lands, the hall became a reminder that freedom was not a universal gift. In Viking belief, the honor of a family was displayed not only in warriors who fought, but in the women who carried the lineage forward. To claim a woman from an enemy was to claim his bloodline, to show that even his descendants could be absorbed into the legacy of the conqueror. This idea was woven into the songs they sang, where triumph was measured by wealth, by cattle, by captives. For the women forced into this vision, existence became a symbol stripped of its own meaning. The society of the time allowed such brutality to thrive. In Francia, in Saxon England, in the distant Slavic lands, women were rarely shielded from the violence of invasion. The chroniclers who recorded the raids often spoke more of kings and armies than of the fates of the wives and daughters taken. Their silence revealed how little the pain of women counted in the eyes of rulers. The Vikings exploited this silence, turning it into another weapon. By displaying captives in their markets and halls, they sent a message to their enemies that resistance would not only bring death for men, but a living fate for those left behind. Within their own communities, Norse women of free birth lived under a different light. Some managed estates in the absence of husbands, some engaged in trade, and sagas speak of women whose counsel carried weight. This duality is striking. A woman of the North could hold influence, while a woman seized in conquest could lose even her name. The same culture that allowed one to own land allowed another to be owned as land. For the wider medieval world, the Viking treatment of women became both a terror and a lesson. Villages fortified their defenses not only to protect warriors but to shield wives and children from the shame of capture. Priests used the horror of such fates as sermons, warning that pagan raiders sought not only gold but souls. In this way, the suffering of captives extended beyond their own lives, becoming part of the narrative that reshaped how kingdoms saw themselves and their enemies. The Viking Age is remembered for its daring voyages and its gods of thunder. Yet its truest mark was carved into the bodies and spirits of women who became unwilling bearers of conquest. Through them, the culture of victory was proclaimed, and through them, the memory of its cruelty was carried into history. As the longships loomed on distant shores, the terror they inspired ran deeper than steel. In the villages that heard the sound of oars and horns, women often knew what awaited them if they were taken alive. Stories spread faster than the raids themselves. Tales of captivity, humiliation, and lives turned into currency traveled from one coast to another. In the hearts of many women, the choice was already formed long before the first axe struck the gate. When defeat came, some refused to be led away. Chronicles tell of wives who hurled themselves into rivers rather than board the ships, of mothers who set fire to their own homes and embraced the flames with their children. In the Baltic lands, priests recorded scenes of women plunging knives into their hearts, while warriors fought their last battle, believing that death was a shield no conqueror could break. These were not acts of despair alone. They were final declarations that their bodies and bloodlines would not be trophies. This grim defiance spread like an invisible rebellion. For every captive dragged into the halls of a Viking chieftain, there were others who vanished into the earth, choosing to be lost to history rather than transformed into living spoils. It was a quiet war fought with courage as fierce as any man's sword. The Vikings measured victory by captives and coin, but they could never fully conquer those who denied them the prize of survival. Yet even this defiance has been forgotten. The sagas praised raiders but left silent the women who burned rather than bow, who drowned rather than be displayed, who cut their lives short to preserve a fragment of dignity. Their deaths were not recorded as battles, but as acts of erasure. Still, these acts echo across time, a dark testament to the cost of conquest and the strength of the voiceless. The Viking Age left behind runestones and tales of distant lands, but its truest legacy lies in the choices of women who refused to become symbols of defeat. Some perished nameless but unbroken. Others survived and carried the wound of survival as a punishment. Together they form a shadowed history far stronger than the myths carved in stone. Picture the smoke rising from a village where women chose the flames. Picture the cold waters swallowing those who leapt rather than submit. These images are not in the sagas, yet they are carved into the memory of the lands once raided. They are the unspoken monuments to a courage that history tried to erase. If you wish to uncover these hidden histories, to hear the voices of those who defied even death, stay with this channel. Like, share, and subscribe so their silence will not remain their only legacy.